So good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Welcome to the first Books About Books event organized by the Association of Jewish Libraries by the RAS division. And we are happy to have you all here. And we are happy to see participants from the US, of course, and also Italy and Germany, and even Greece. So it's an honor to have with us today Sefer Marc Michaels, who will discuss his recent book, Sefer Tagin, Fragments from the Cairo Genizah. In his book, Michaels transcribes and recreates fragments of arguably the earliest found manuscript of the manual for Sofrim concerning the decorative Tagin and strange letter forms that adorn certain words in the Torah. He compares these found fragments against other core and secondary sources of Sefer Tagin and establishes the most likely readings to assist the reconstruction of the fragments and shed light on the original intention of the author of Sefer Tagin. In his lecture, he will discuss how the book came to be, the new finds, and see some of the manuscripts that bring these old traditions to life. The event will be moderated by AJL's Chaim Gottschalk, the Hebraica and Judaica cataloging librarian of the Asian and Middle Eastern Division, Israel and Judaica section of the Library of Congress. And I will be taking questions at the end of the lecture. For those who don't know me, I'm the president of RAS division, Amalia Levy. At this point, we will kindly ask you to mute your microphones. And following the end of the lecture, you can use the Zoom to raise your hand and we will have the Q&A. And Chaim, to you.
Thank you, Amalia. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our first Association of Jewish Libraries, RAS special Books About Books series talk. A few words about Marc Michaels. Marc is studying for his PhD at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Fitzwilliam College at Cambridge University in a field that's related to scribal studies and Hebrew manuscripts. Marc is also a Sefer, a scribe, and he does scribal workshops around the communities in England. His interests include codicology and paleography of medieval Hebrew manuscripts, archival studies, and the Cairo Genizah. The format will be that Marc will start presenting first, and then afterwards we'll have questions, and feel free to use the chat to ask questions. And now I present to you Marc Michaels. Marc, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chaim. Welcome everybody. I saw a few familiar names come up. That was great. So I'm going to put up a presentation deck shortly, and because there's lots of images and pictures in this, so you won't have to listen to me be sort of boring, and so you'll see the pictures and the images, and they're very exciting, much more exciting than I am. I am please beg your forgiveness is that I spent the whole day pitching to clients in my other life as a communications expert, so I'll try not to pitch at you. It's very difficult because I was literally doing a drinks client previously, so which you kind of need at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
You are muted.
Marc, you're muted.
It muted me for some reason. Am I now back on?
Yes.
Good,
yes.
Excellent. Right, one of the things I have noticed about Zoom is that if you try and present a PowerPoint in its normal presentation mode, it's very, very slow. But if you present it like this with the sidebar open, it tends to work a little bit better. So I'm going to be talking to you about this, which is my new book. Slightly weird in that normally a PhD student will publish at the end of his PhD and not at the beginning of the PhD. I was just chatting with Chaim about that. It is a slightly weird thing because of that. So a little bit about me in terms of who I am. I'm a strategy and creative director in my kind of real life and in a London marketing agency. I also used to work for the government as one of the heads of communications here. which is a little bit weird just from the point of view of sort of marketing. However, because of that, fundamentally, I'm a graphic designer at heart and a creative. And once upon a time, my parents went to a conference in this country. My dad used to be the chairman of the Reformed Synagogues movement in the country. And they went down for breakfast, and there was no one there except a little old man. He was about 75. His name was Vivian Solomon, and he was a Sefer, and he'd been looking for a student for something like 10 years, but he couldn't find anybody because he needed someone who was graphically inclined, but also interested in the halacha. And that's very right brain, left brain, and you don't normally get that in the same person. And my parent basically said, yeah, we know someone like that. And Vivian didn't really kind of, he didn't ask me to be his student. He kind of almost ordered me to be his student. He'd been looking for someone for some considerable time. So I've been a Sefer stum for over 25 years. But recently, what I've done is the stuff I do for fun outside in my sort of private life in terms of studying stuff, and particularly my interest in Sefer Tagin, I suddenly realized that actually I could do something more with that. And so I became the first part-time PhD student at FAME. So they never take part-time students. So I had to have a special case made for me because it's slightly weird again. And the book is really what got me into Cambridge in the first place, because I basically said to them, I know I'm part-time, but actually I've done a lot of research already, and here is the research. And they said, oh, that looks good. Perhaps we can turn that into a book. The only danger with that, of course, is that as I'm working through my research, I'm finding mistakes, but more importantly, I'm finding other stuff that I would have gone, if I'd have just known about that, I would have put that in the book. Or if I'd just had clearer imagery, I'd have put that in the book. So there is a negative side to having a book quite so early on, but it's an interesting thing. So that's a little bit about me. I don't know how much you guys know about Tagin. So Tagin are these little ornaments that sit on the top of certain letters. There's a line there at the top of that slide, which is from my most recent Megillah Esther. And you can see that some of the letters have 3 of these little Tagin, and some only have 1, and some have none at all. Some have things that kind of look a little bit like Tagin. So you can see there's a thing there on the Aleph. Oh, shouldn't do that because it moves it around. The Aleph is got a little thing. That's a kotz. That's not a tag. That's a little thorn thing. But it's a special decoration that's only used in Kitvei Kodesh, the holy writings. Some of them, and it's known as the Shartner's Guts, it's the acronym, they have 3. But Achaya have 1, and some, and this is the freaky thing, because it spells out Melechet Sofer, which means the work of the scribe. That's dead cool, by the way. They have none. I think it's a bit sad that the work of the scribe has no decoration, but it's still a very cool, mystical type of thing. So this has always been a massive source of fascination for me over the years, because what it allows you to do as a scribe is to kind of add some individual personality. There are masses and masses of rules, tons and tons of rules around the scribe book. I've got loads of books on my shelves of all the rules of all the letters and what you can do and what you can't do and what's not allowed, what's doubtful, what's okay, and so on. And it's very hard, therefore, to put your own personality into the writing, and Tagin occasionally allow you to do that. And I've given you some examples here of some very ornate forms, some sort of fireworks and trees and rainbows and all sorts of lovely decorative things. The pomegranates actually came from my wife, who's on this, Aviella Barkley, who was the first modern Soferet. So she was the first modern female scribe. And just the creativity that individual scribes are trying to put into their work is very exciting. However, and this is very important, lovely as those decorative Tagin are, they have absolutely nothing to do with Sefer Tagin. So it's very, very important to recognize that. Tagin come out of the sort of traditional halachic reference for this is Tosfot to Menachot 29b, and you can see there's a picture over there where it shows you 3 Tagin, and of course, because it's rabbis, they're arguing over where those 3 Tagin should be. Should they be on the sides? Should they be splayed? Should there one go downwards? That one going downwards is very important, by the way, because there's lots of arguments over downward pointing Tagin, and quite a lot of scribes who try to employ Sefer Tagin, they'll ignore those downwards ones. So sometimes if it says you should have 5, they'll end up with 4 because they don't want the downward one. So it's quite an interesting thing. Sorry. So that's the main thing. And in the actual Talmud itself, it talks about the Sha'at Nezgaz that I mentioned with the 3 Tagin on each letter. This all stems from a story of Moses time traveling. Hence, I finally got to put a TARDIS in an academic presentation. For any of you Doctor Who fans out there, it's very important. So what happens is that Moshe ascends Mount Sinai. He sees God writing the Torah, and he's adding these decorations. And he's saying, God, why are you taking time to decorate this stuff? And God turned around and says, well, it's very important because there's going to be a rabbi called Rabbi Akiva, and he is going to derive heaps and heaps of laws because of these Tagin. Moses says, oh, show me. So he takes him into the future and sits in Rabbi Akiva's class. He doesn't understand a single word, which is quite telling because it means the difference between rabbinical Judaism and biblical Judaism is such that Moses doesn't know what's going on. But they say it's a halacha mi Moshe misina, which is code for this has been going on for a very, very long time. And then sadly, God takes it to the future where Rabbi Akiva is martyred. And Moses kind of has an argument with God about this because what a horrible thing to happen to such a wonderful person. Interestingly enough, though, no laws are derived from heap. There are no heaps and heaps of laws derived from the Tagin at all. In the Midrash, they're quite often seen to be daggers, because they're often referred to as zionim, which zion is it's a slang word for something not very pleasant, but it also means sort of dagger. They're supposed to be daggers on those letters to protect us from Satan, Ez, and Guts, who are obviously, you can make those words out of Shat and Guts. That's the play on words there. Lots of commentators talk about the Tagin and whether they are an integral part of the letter and whether not having them invalidates the letter. Rambam, who's sort of the main voice on this, argues that it doesn't matter if they're not there. It's okay as long as the letter form is there. Other commentators say, no, it's got to be integral. And then they argue about the forms and the purpose. And as you can see, even from the earliest references, no one quite knew whether they were straight lines or balls with straight lines or upwards or downwards or so on. So again, lots and lots of arguments. Sefer Tagin is a book about the book. So fundamentally, it's a scribal manual. It's held to be from Gaonic times, possibly earlier though, and it covers extra Tagin. So not just 3 or 1 or 0, but loads. And the biggest one is Aleph, it has 7. And also the special letter forms, what's known as Otiyot Mishunot. Mishunot means kind of weird or strange. I quite often call them scribal oddities because I don't like strange or weird. It sounds a bit negative. And there's a list of words that have these special things in them. But unfortunately, every single edition is corrupt. Every single edition. There is not a single version out there that is not incomplete, either because they've left stuff out, omitted stuff, or they've made copyist errors, or because scribes are human and we make mistakes. You know, I was a Magia on somebody else's Torah. He made about 7 mistakes per Amud. I looked through my latest Megillah, I'd made 4 mistakes. You can correct certain things, you can't correct stuff in God's name, it's much harder. Possibly the worst version, oddly enough, is the most famous version. And that's the one that's been printed in Latin, actually. This is I can't actually read part of this book because it's in Latin. The Hebrew bit's not a problem, but the Latin, no, completely beyond me. So that's the image of the printed book, and Liber Coronalarum, I can't even say it. And it's good, but it's got very bad transcriptions in it, and it has 60 letter hey missing. So literally they skipped a couple of pages in whatever manuscript they were copying from. And so as a result, it is properly corrupt. And yeah, if you search for Sefer Tagin, apart from seeing my book now, you will see this come up, and people will download that and assume that's Sefer Tagin. But it kind of isn't, because it's one of the worst representations. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but fundamentally, there is a discussion over who wrote Sefer Tagin. So I'll just translate that into English. At the start of Sefer Tagin, and it may well be that this is not part of the original, this may have been added later. It says, this is the book of Tagin, that Eli the priest established from the 12 stones that Joshua erected at Gilgal. And there's a story at the end of the Torah and the start of Joshua, where it talks about these 12 stones that were possibly painted, and then they wrote the whole Torah on it. And then it was transmitted to this person, who transmitted to this person, who transmitted to this person. Does this sound familiar? Mishnah Avot 1:1, right? The Torah was given on to Moshe on Sinai, and he transmitted to these guys and these guys and these guys and these guys. This is all about authority implied through antiquity. So if you can link your book to people who have gone before and important people and show where it's come from, then it's more likely to have been adopted. And so it goes through all of the traditions. It also tells a little bit of story of the fact it was found in the temple area. I don't know if you remember, Shaphan, the scribe, found Deuteronomy. So all of these techniques are there very much to give an authority to this book. So it is an important book for the scribes. But oddly enough, even though it is important, as I mentioned, all of the copies we have, and we don't have that many copies, they're all corrupt. So if it's so important, as part of my research, if it's so important, why is it so corrupt? Why aren't there more copies out there if this is something that scribes are supposed to do? Part of the problem is that this has been transmitted what's called ish mipi ish, which means scribe to scribe, man to man. There are female scribes now, as I've mentioned, but it's man to man. So it's not actually technically part of the halacha. So it is really quite personal, and it's been passed down. It's a bit like my scribal teacher. I was his Padawan to do the Star Wars thing, since I've done Doctor Who. And in effect, I'm basically, instead of having a lightsaber, I have a quill. You are an apprentice in the true sense of it, and stuff is passed down. And this stuff is exactly that, it's passed down. So it's written in Aramaic. It gives a description of the form of the special letter. Either it has an oddity in shape, or it has extra Tagin, or sometimes it's both. So even though it's called Sefer Tagin, it isn't always the case that the oddity is about extra Tagin. Sometimes, and I'll show you some really odd ones later. Most of them only have one special form, but some have two. And one of them, Ayin, has three. And I'm working through Ayin particularly at the moment. It's quite complicated. And also scribes confuse them. If they do have more than one, scribes through history, particularly in medieval times, have confused them and mixed them up and mixed up the forms. So that gets very confusing as well. So it lists how many instances there are in the Torah with the special form and the words, sometimes within a short phrase, to try and identify it. That can cause problems sometimes, because sometimes the same words are repeated more than once. And what scribes will do is, if they're unsure, they'll add some extras. So that confuses things in some of the sources as well. Sometimes you might have one or two in a phrase. So if it's two of them, it will say talvehon, which is both of them in the phrase. Sometimes it's talteon, which is three of them in Aramaic. Hopefully I'm not going too fast for you guys. The text also refers to kadma, which is the first. Which can be the first occurrence of a phrase, or the first occurrence in a sentence, or the first occurrence in the actual word, if it has the same letter in there twice. Very confusing. So you're never quite sure when it's saying the first, whether it's what the first what, and batra, which is also the last. So it's the same thing. So sometimes it's not clear what is intended, and it's really quite hard. Usually each instance has a little mark on it or a dot, but sometimes that gets forgotten, placed in error, which leads to confusion. Sometimes they transfer words around to what's called metathesis or dittography, where they repeat stuff. Haplography. One of the things that the printed versions, it copies down. Sometimes it occasionally copies down the space fillers, the line fillers at the end of the sentence, as if it's an extra instance. Really confusing. And on rare occasions, no source, as far as I'm concerned, and this is this is me making a guess here, actually brings what is probably the correct reading. And certainly in the book, one of the things I suggest around the letter tav, there is one where I think everybody's got it wrong. So I say, for such an important document, which has been passed down, ish be ish, there's relatively few copies. Some of them are alphabetical, so they list the letters in order, and some of them are done by parsha. The parsha ones are really complicated because they quite often will mess stuff up because they've left stuff out, whereas the alphabetical ones tend to have more correct stuff in them. So I've classed them in the book as core and secondary. Kind of wrong word, actually. I've changed my mind about secondary. It's more compilation, because what they've done is they've taken Sefer Tagin and then they've compiled in lots of other stuff, like the Nun Hafucha or the B'Yashemo, which is the 6 columns that are different to the Vavei Ha'amudim. So the Vavei Ha'amudim is a scribal practice where each column of the Torah starts with the letter Vav, but it's a very modern practice. It didn't used to happen at all. And in fact, the Haggah Maimonite basically says that all scribes who do this are borim, which means they're ignoramuses. Because what they used to do is they used to stretch the letters too much to accommodate it. Now we've got standard tikkunim that are pretty good at that, but actually the Vavei Ha'amudim is a very modern thing. But the 6 letters that are supposed to, so the Bereshit, the Bet of Bereshit, and the Mem of Matovu, it's called B'Yashmo, that's been around for quite some time. Even in the non-traditional tikkun, the older ones where they're much more variable, that will be there. Although again, there's arguments over exactly which letters are supposed to be the start and which columns are supposed to be the start. But what happens is some of these compilation ones, they stick those in with the large letters and the small letters and the reverse letters and the bent letters and the curled letters and the dotted letters. So actually, it isn't really just Sefer Tagin anymore. It's a kind of Sefer Tagin plus. And so the British Library had MS 27201, which is the example you've got there. That's a nice one. It's fairly clear, although the original scan I had was pretty bad, actually. Bit fuzzy, and there's some water damage as well. So where I've had some difficulties in the past, got much clearer images now. So that's helping my research. It's a core source, but it's in Parsha order. And as a result, there's more omissions occurring. So it's occasionally he'll just leave out, and if there's like only 1 or 2 instances in a Parsha for a particular, he'll just leave them out because he missed them. So that's a problem for when you're looking at this sort of stuff. This one is very special, and I actually included it at the back of the book, and there is now links to better versions online as well, because This one had disappeared off the face of the earth. It literally had vanished. When I was doing the book, I had an extremely bad scan to work from, which was from the JNUL, which is very kind of them to loan to me, but it was extremely bad. You couldn't read very much about it at all. It was known as Sassoon 82. It's now Judd 002, and it's held now by Mr. Jackie Safra in Geneva. It was written by the Badei Aaron, which is Rabbi Shem Tov Ibn Gaon ben Avraham. Very, very important person. And he brings it in alphabetical order. However, even he, bless him, made mistakes, because when I first encountered it, as I mentioned in 2017, it was a scan based on images held in the National Library in Israel, very difficult to read. It was particularly pronounced on the first folio. And the reason for that is when I finally discovered what was going on around the edges, is Shem Tov, the genius, had actually left out Tet, Yud, Kaf, and Kaf Sofit, and he'd moved straight to Lamed on the next page. Then he clearly realized that he'd left it out, and he wrote it all the way around the edges, bless him. But those were the bits that were most damaged, really very, very bad. So it just so happens that one of my colleagues, a chap called Nehemiah Gordon, who interviewed me once, and a very nice chap from the States, he and a Karaite, actually, very few Karaites I know, but he's a Karaite. He happened to be photographing stuff for Jackie Safra, and he stumbled across it, and because he was the first reviewer on the book, he actually said, "You're looking for this, aren't you?" And I went, "Yes, I absolutely am looking for this." So I sent him this little thing in the corner, which basically said, "Could you please photograph very closely all these edges around the side?" And he did it, and he also did it in infrared, which helps enormously. So again, subsequent to the book, sadly, I mean, I got a little bit of change into the book, but not as much as I would have liked. We have a much better version of this particular manuscript that had just disappeared off the planet because it had gone into a private collection. Palmer 2574, which I call P, is probably considered to be the most complete and the oldest complete version. Still has mistakes in it, but it tends to be the one that people use as a basis, which is quite nice. But even it is inconsistent in its usage. It's inconsistent with how the forms are displayed. It displays the forms during it and at the end as well. There is a beautiful manuscript, beautiful manuscript. Sorry, oh, I'm there. Beautiful manuscript here, which is the which is in the British Library, but unfortunately, MS 27167 only has Bereshit. Just literally only has Bereshit. So that is very sad. But it's lovely in terms of the way it's been written. Probably the craziest manuscript is the one MS 11639, because, and this happens with Masoretic instructions, quite often they turn them into decorations. So even though they're Masoretic instructions, it happens with the proper Masoret. And there is actually now a new program which is called Corpus Masoreticum, and I've reached out to them to get involved because they're next to impossible to read. And this is probably it's the best, but it's also the worst page. It's in terms of an offender. It just goes all over the place, round and up and down and moving around. It's a composite one as well, which means it has more than just Sefer Tagin in it. It has the Petuchot and Stumot, it has all sorts of stuff in it, but it is really hard to read. And I can't do it on screen anymore. I've printed it out and I go like this and like this. And there must be a better way of doing it. Badei Aaron, there is another manuscript which just gives the descriptions of the forms and also some pictures of the forms. So we have a kind of way of cross-referencing Shem Tov Ibn Gaon, because he's got his own listing. He's got it used in his Tanakh, and then there's this extra manuscript as well called Ebru 840 from France, which is the BNF, and that's almost like a triangulation. They don't always agree, they're all supposed to be coming from the same person. So that's quite interesting in itself. Then Palmer 2427 is a variant of a compiled Sefer Tagin. I've been working on that lately, looking at Ayin. It's part of a Tikkun Sofrim, so the copyist guide, and he is very inconsistent with his usage of the forms. He mixes them up. He's very confused. But it's very nice. It's lovely and clear, which is very nice to work with. And then there is Palmer 1959. Now that one, interestingly enough, is virtually identical in structure and form to that beautiful one that we only have from Genesis of Bereshit. So actually, they have been copied from the same source. They are so far found one difference between them, which is helpful. But unfortunately, again, the version I had, but I've got the better versions of this one now. So this is interesting, but it's written in a very different script to the rest of them. It also uses different titles for the parashiot. So basically, you have to kind of have your brain in gear when you're looking at that one. This is a recent find. Again, I had a very bad scan of this, but now I have a link to the actual manuscript that's online, which is really nice, 651, 652. And this has also been written by a very important authority. Now, the interesting thing, if you have the authorities, they have an issue because they're so important and clever. They are quite happy to add extra stuff in. If they're not sure, they'll just make it up because they're important enough to do that. So that's quite interesting as a pattern. This is a partial survivor. So this was, you may have heard of the Books Within Books project. So this is the books about books. So this is books within books. This is the sad thing that Jewish manuscripts were used as coverings on Christian books. This was mislabeled. And in fact, a lot of these things have been mislabeled. That's why it's hard to track these things down. But this is literally a page from a core source that was on a manuscript. It's based in Austria at the moment. It's listed as Tikkun Sofrim. It is not a Tikkun Sofrim. It is a part of Sefer Tagin. And that kind of got me thinking about manuscripts generally. So were there any other things? Well, there was one staring us right in the face. So I mentioned the 272011, which was listed by Parashah. Before that, there's another listing of a compiled Sefer Tagin. So that's a real core Sefer Tagin. This is a secondary one. But because the scribe, bless them, the scribe tried to write the list and gave up, literally gave up a few pages in, was adding all of the decorations, really very clear, and then just gave up and just listed the words. So maybe that's why it never got noticed, but it is there. And it literally was before the other one, and no one ever really referenced that one. So that was quite interesting. I went off looking at Torahs and codices and stuff like that. I even wrote a book about one of them. This is the Torah in the Wardrobe. This is a scroll that was saved from Nazi Germany, and it has all the Sefer Tagin stuff in there. It's really interesting. Some really lovely pictures. Possibly the most ornate pay with Tagin I've ever seen on all of them, although I've seen some other ones that are really interesting. And then there was a book recently published by Mauro in Italy, which is about the Bologna Torah, which is very famous as well. The problem about the Torahs and the Yaakov Basso wrote a more sort of religious book about Sefer Tagin and has, I'm told, actually written Torah based on that, which is great. I only found that out this week, which is marvelous, from a chap called Mordechai Weintraub. Very interesting. I helped him out with one of his PowerPoints. There's probably about 80% of Sefer Tagin in there. It's pretty good. The other Torahs, it can be as little as 30%, 40%. It varies enormously. And so you can't really use a Torah or a Codex a codex as a particularly good source. Good source is the Cairo Genizah, which you would have heard about from the point of view of it's a collection of 400,000 Jewish manuscript fragments. And every time anybody has ever presented to me about the Cairo Genizah, they have this picture of Solomon Schechter, which is a beautiful, wonderful atmospheric picture of sitting there surrounded by fragments, boxes. Dr. Ben Althwaite is one of my joint supervisors. He has a box in his office, and it's just like being there. It's wonderful. But it's a perfect example of what happened. There are all these fragments and they're strewn all over the place. So trying to pull them together is really hard. And in fact, I was told by Ben that they had some of them were actually in book form and they separated them. I don't know why. This is very weird. So now people are trying to piece them back together and find these things in the Genizah. And the Genizah itself, most of it is in Cambridge, but there's lots in Oxford. And there's lots all over the world. There's loads of bits of Genizah all over the place. So it's really hard to sort of track this stuff down. It all came from the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, which was old Cairo. I attended a lecture virtually in Cairo. They're actually starting to find some more Genizah fragments coming through. So that will be very interesting as time moves on. So the first find wasn't really a find. It was known already. It had been completely mislabeled. It's described as a fragment of grammatical treatise in Arabic. It's Aramaic. It's not in Arabic at all. Part of the Masorah Finalis. It's not. It's actually Mem Sophi through to Ayin in Sefer Tagin. It's an alphabetical one. It's probably as old as the one that I majored on and discovered in the book, but it's quite different. It's probably written in Israel, likely 11th century, but it's Sefer Tagin. And I was just like, okay, so if this has been mislabeled, then other things will have been mislabeled as well. Ben suggested that I look under Masorah in the Cambridge Genizah collection. I'm literally eyeballing them one by one. It's quite, I did 100 the other night, literally going through the Genizah project and looking at stuff. I'm still looking because there will be there. So I found 2 pages from another manuscript version of Sefer Tagin, which is D1 4.42. It had been mislabeled as a lexicography, but it mentioned Hay to Tet are preserved. And indeed, that is the case. Looking at the script paleographically, probably again Israel, probably again 11th century, so just as old as the Oxford fragment. And I was thinking, okay, well, this is great. There is stuff in the Genizah. We have to find more. There is a joins function on the Freiburg Genizah project. It didn't yield much, so I ended up doing lots of manual searches. But I stumbled across some more fragments, which was wonderful. So these are the 2 that are a big part of the book. They are nicely preserved. Obviously there's staining on it. There's some holes. There's parts of it that are slightly harder to read, but they're generally mostly there. On the other hand, the other fragments, not so good. These ones were literally bits of pages, holes in them, missing bits, and so on. So what I thought is, okay, well, it might be worth trying to digitally reassemble them, because it looked like they were joins. They actually were joined together, and they were parts of the same pages. But before that happened, I'd obviously been a nuisance in the Cambridge Genizah unit, and Dr. Kim Phillips in the unit, he spotted another fragment, MISC 24.182, and he shared it with me and said, I think this is Sefer Tagin. And I went, well, yes, it is, and it isn't. It's one of those compilations. So it has Sefer Tagin embedded in it. It misses stuff. It's got some differences, but it also has lots of other stuff as well. So it's got 4 pages. Now, unlike the other ones that are written on parchment, on cloth, this is written on rag paper. And we thought, oh, we might be able to see the watermark and get a better dating on it. We held it up to the light in Ben's office, and no, there was no watermark whatsoever. So that was kind of annoying. It's written in Masha'it script, so it could be anywhere between 12th and 13th century. It could be a bit later. We're not very sure. But it has some very nice stuff. One of the things you can see here as well is he put in Hashem's name incorrectly. He put something around it because he couldn't cross it out. It's not allowed to. So he put a sort of circle-y, ovally thing around it to make sure that people didn't realize that that's not supposed to be there. So I started reconstructing. So I digitally cut out the fragments. I created a font. I'm a graphic designer, so I can do that kind of stuff. So I created a font from the oldest source, and using the core and secondary sources allowed me to start to reconstruct 4 pages of the manuscript, transcribing it and translating it, and the Oxford one as well, and the new secondary finds. So the book is mainly the translation and transcription and reconstruction of as many pages as I could get, to covering as many letters as I could do. So it fundamentally goes from part of the end of the first list of hay, which is the biggest by far, and they've only got a little bit of that, all the way up to the first ayin, and then there's a gap for tav. So there's still stuff that I would want to find. There's more pages that I want to find to look and compare them against the core and secondary sources, but particularly from the form point of view, because as a graphic designer, what is important to me is the variances, so comparing the letter forms. And you can see here just some of the weird forms. So this is a Zayin, and it's one of the Zayins, and you can see completely from the different manuscripts how absolutely weird and wacky they are. And some of them don't look like a Zayin at all. Some of them look like a kuf, which means they would be pasul in modern scribal practice. So you can't use them. So you have to adapt them and work out forms that you could use. That's one of the things that Yaakov Basar has done. I think what he's done is a little bit too cautious. I would like to do something a bit more interesting. These two are, every time I find new ones, it's just like, that's a vav, right? Those ones that look like a nun or a pay or a heavens knows, I have no idea. I have no idea what that is supposed to be. That's just proper weird. And these are supposed to be yuds. And these are all in manuscripts, and they're all in Sefer Torah. And in the past, these were considered perfectly fine. Now, under much more modern, stricter scribal practice, absolutely not. You just would not be allowed to do this kind of stuff. So you've got to adapt it, and it's very important that I work out ways of adapting it to modern use that stays as true to the original as we possibly can, and doesn't lose some of the charm. Because one of the things as a scribe I have noticed through my career is, whilst there's been a lot of movement to standardization and harmonization, and this gets stricter, and it's very machmir, it's very strict, very strict, very strict. It wasn't like that. So in just going back to this book here, this would be considered pasul in some cases, but the reality is it was perfectly fine. And there were actually 2 scribes. There was a master scribe and his student, and the student, his writing wasn't particularly good, but he was trying desperately to learn ish mipi ish, and he was doing the same stuff. He was trying to maintain these traditions, and a lot of these traditions have died out, partly because of the Nazis and the damage done to European Judaism and scribes and wiping out the memory of how to do these things. So that's another reason why I want to bring this sort of stuff back, and people like Marcel wants to do that, and other people in the field. But also, just from the point of view of, it doesn't necessarily have to be this strict. If these things were accepted, so I wouldn't go quite as far as ones that look like a cuff or look like a cuff where they're supposed to be a yud and stuff like that. I wouldn't go that far. But the reality is that, you know, harmonization shouldn't take the charm from our tradition. So I'm continuing my researches. The fragments are partial. They don't cover all of the listings. There's more work to do. I want to find additional fragment joins. I know there are joins out there. I'm still looking for them. I will find them down. I've made more discoveries as I go through. The stuff I'm doing about core and secondary, which are now core and compiled sources, that's very interesting. The way different authorities have combined things is also very interesting. So there's more to learn. There's more to unpick. The book is the start. It is literally the start of the journey. I am by no means finished. There is much more to learn. There is much more to discover. And that's how it goes. Even down to when I was in Ben's office. When I was in Ben's office, he brought up from the Genizah unit the actual fragment that I found. I've been looking at it blowing up massive on a screen. I've been looking on a screen blowing up. To me, it was this enormous thing. It's not. It's pretty tiny. It's a small notebook. It's no bigger than the notebook I'm using at the moment to write stuff down in. It is not a halachic tome. You know, it's not a massive Talmud. It's not this kind of thing and stuff. It's not that. It is literally a scribal notebook that has been kept by a particular scribe. This is his way of making sure that he's doing the right thing as far as he is concerned to carry on this important tradition. And this particular scribe is quite cautious, because when you look at his forms, if he's not sure about the form, he doesn't make it up. He puts a little dot on top of it to say, I'm not sure about this. I'm still working on it. So just like him, I'm also still working on it. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
Yes, at this point we are taking questions. You can raise your hand and we will take them in the order that they come.
So let me see. There was one hand raised. There was one.
Hi, Bell.
Hi, thank you. And if I may, it's a different kind of question. So my child and I have all sorts of associations with the Cairo Genizah unit that's at the Cambridge Library. And last fall, when we were there, we were all of us very surprised to see that there wasn't on some main level an exhibit talking about the importance of the project. So then we went to talk to someone and we actually got lost in the stacks because we went up the wrong elevator. You're laughing, so I don't have to explain. And then when we got to the office, there wasn't an exhibit case outside the office. So I started talking to someone, and I think the pandemic has interrupted. And since there was no other hand up, it's a little personal, but my family offered to fund a permanent exhibit case. So random passerby or even people looking, knowing the importance of this, can see some explanation. And it didn't actually, just the ball got dropped, and it may be pandemic. By any chance, would you be someone who they look at now differently if I contacted you separately?
If you contacted me, I can talk to them. The one thing I would say, though, and what tends to happen is that there are traveling exhibitions, there are temporary exhibitions, because these are manuscripts and they're quite old and they're quite fragmentary and they are delicate and also will be affected by light. They have to be properly controlled environments. So permanent displays are quite often off the agenda. And they sort of,
let me be clear. What I was proposing, and given what's going on or may not be going on as much in England when we were there last fall with the whole anti-Semitism issue, was not any permanent collection, but was reproductions and explanations of why this was so important culturally. And for me, I shouldn't say for me, for us as a family, we wanted it to see somewhere where, I mean, if you know enough about it, you'll eventually find your way to the office. If they have time, make an appointment. A guard will get you through which elevator. But just in terms of cultural significance, and that would be reproductions and explanations. But I found your website and I will email you. So now you know it isn't an order for a new Torah. It's, could you help me make this donation?
More than happy to talk to Ben. So Ben, Dr. Althwaite is the main man there. He's the person. Everybody has been, you're quite right, lockdown has been very difficult for everybody. I mean, he's feeling quite, well, we're all quite adrift, because the best thing to do is be in there and flick through the manuscripts. We're doing it remotely. I mean, I provided sort of updates on certain things and recategorizations of things and stuff, and we can't make all of those changes. So it's quite hard at the moment. Makes researching just a tad harder for everybody, I think.
Marc, can I ask you, this is Chaim, can I ask you two questions? One, has Sefer Tagin been translated? Like, are you finding fragments that maybe Judeo-Arabic or another language?
Other than the translation that I've now done in the book, I am not aware of anybody ever translating the Aramaic into anything else. The printed book talks about Sefer Tagin in Latin, but it doesn't actually list it. It doesn't translate it into Latin. That would be really complicated. Aramaic into Latin, I think my brain would explode. But no, I'm not aware of anybody listing it. I'm aware that people have done lists and partial lists in articles, but that tends to be in Hebrew. I mean, obviously Hebrew words, but it generally appears in Aramaic. I think possibly the book is the first time it's been in English. But it is, to say, only partial, and it's only the fragments that I've been dealing with so far. So yeah, eventually, yes, I'm sure there will be, whether it's me or someone else, a critical edition of Sefer Tagin. Right. To a certain extent, I will end up doing a critical edition of the whole thing, but purely as a stepping stone to other research.
Oh, I look forward to that. There's a question now from Barry Walford. Let me just unmute Barry. Okay. All right.
Oh, hi. Let me just.
Hello, Barry.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering what you said, that you're in the middle of doing your doctorate now. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm a part-time PhD student at Cambridge, and this is sort of the foundation work, and I'm now moving on with different questions and different things that I'm looking, still around Sefer Tagin, still around manuscripts, but widening the scope.
I see. So the book is sort of like the foundation, and you're
the book is
the
foundation building blocks that you may not have been at the start, but basically in order to get into Cambridge, because I'm a part-timer and they've never taken a part-timer before, I had to prove that I had done a lot of research already. And so I went in with my research, 2 years worth of it, and they said, "Oh, this could make a good book," and which was great. But as I say, unfortunately, at that point, I hadn't got as much access to all of the things that I would have liked. But it's a good start. It's a good start.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, I'll be in touch with you because I have other questions I want to pursue.
Super. Thanks, Larry.
Okay, thank you.
Let me see if there's more questions here. Marc, can I ask you just one other question, if I may? In terms of local tradition, is it reflected in as you started touching upon this, we've kind of lost it now in terms of trying to harmonize more. But is there, like in terms of like localities that have preserved some of the
There are definitely in the Sefer Torah, and so I've located about 100. I know some people have located more. There are definitely some variances locally, but it's scribes copying from scribes.
Okay.
So the reality is you will do probably something very similar to your teacher, unless you're a more modern scribe, in which case you've got access to. So for example, my writing, and I used to fool my teacher's teacher with this one, because he used to say, Dr. Eric Ray used to say, he was a software from the States, and he used to say he could tell a scribe where they came from, how fat they were by the angle of the writing and the sort of stuff like that. And I sent him a scanned piece of my work, and he said 16th century Poland, and I said no, it was last week. But the reason is because the scribal technique that I adopted, because I liked it, because I think it was the prettiest, because of the aesthetic, was 16th century Poland. So he was right. He was wrong, but he was right. Because you adopt stuff. And as I progressed through my career, if I showed you my first Megillah, you'd just be horrified. It's terrible writing. You get better. And so different scribes will improve over time. They'll also get exposed to other people's work. And I will go, I like the way they do that. I'm going to introduce that into my work. And it is practical. So, I mean, a couple of the things that I've done with Sefer Tagin. So one of the things I got commissioned to write the first ever modern piece of liturgy. It's called Megillat HaShoah. So it was written, and I devised the tikkun for Megillat HaShoah, and I used some of the techniques from Sefer Tagin to emphasize certain words, important things in there. I also did something around Megillat B'nai Hashmonai, it was also known as Megillat Antiochus, and created a tikkun for that, comparing 21 manuscripts, and also used Sefer Tagin occasionally, he's a chet and shoch, to convey some kind of message, because that's, and there's tons of midrash, there's tons of explaining this stuff as to why it's important. So it's not just what it looks like, it's what it means.
Right.
It brings layers to the. It brings an extra layer of exegesis to the text.
Thank you, Marc. Molly, do we have more questions?
Sorry, we have 3 questions by David Shaby.
3?
Yes,
3.
So,
so why were Tagin developed for letters? Do final letters have Tagin? And then in Talmud, Rabbi Gamliel says Torah can be written in Greek as well as Hebrew. Are there Tagin for Greek?
Right, there are no Tagin for Greek. Final letters do. So Nun Sofit has Tagin, has 3 Tagin. For example, Tzadi Sofit has 3 Tagin. So yes, Mem obviously doesn't have any Tagin, normal or things like that. As to why, there's the big question. And that's part of what I'm doing, but it's about layering and exegesis, and trying to understand a bit more. I don't think anybody will ever know exactly why, but from a decorative point of view, it certainly makes the letters stand out. Ktav Ashuri, the holy script that we use as Sofrim, we're not allowed to use on non-holy material. So, if I write a get, for example, so I write Gittin, the divorce documents, you can't, it's a very close script I use, but it's not Ktav Ashuri as you would see it in the Torah, because you're not allowed to use that. It's a holy script, and it has these things as integral to it. Hopefully that answered the 3 questions.
Molly, do we have time? It's 1:30 now. Do we have time for like another question or 2?
I think we are fine as long as there is discussion. We are fine,
Wow. So Marc,
So-
can I ask you then? So you say we've done I don't say we've not really done away with. I mean, because we still have Tagin in the Sefer Torah, but not the ornate letters anymore, right?
To be honest, yeah, in modern Sefer Torah, you generally wouldn't see it. There, you go back, couple of 100 years, 150 years, they're in there. The Czech Scrolls Memorial Trust, I don't know if you're familiar with the Czech Scrolls Memorial Trust, they're in the Westminster Synagogue. Lovely story. They managed that these 1,500 plus scrolls were rescued from the Nazis. And he's quite sure about exactly the background of the stories. They were stored in a warehouse in Czechoslovakia. They found their way to Westminster when they were discovered after the war. A scribe, bless him, scribe knocked on the door, said, "I'm a scribe. Do you have any Torahs I could fix?" They went, "Yeah, 1,500. And he went, "Ah." And he apparently stayed there for 20 years. So, and there are very few of us who are allowed to fix these Sefer Torah. I'm one of them, my wife is one of them, because modern strict scribes who are more dati will sometimes correct these things. And one of the rules I wrote, so I wrote the rules for any scribe working on the Czech memorial scrolls. You must adhere to the halakha as it was back then and not as it is now. People will come along and correct stuff. And that's horrible because they're fundamentally erasing the heritage because it was perfectly fine back then.
Right.
And these things need to be there. They need to be remembered.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Marc, thank you very, very much. Thank you so much. I'm glad we were able to connect and have you come and speak to us today. I enjoyed your talk and you had a nice turnout today. Thank you so much. I wish you much luck in your continuing in your PhD program.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing more publications from you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Marc, for your discussion. Thanks to everyone who participated. If there are no other questions, we can then conclude.
Thank you, everyone. If you'd like to visit my site, you'll see that there's lots of stuff about software generally. There are also some unpublished publications and little practical adventures into halakha and scribal practice. So there's lots of stuff and lots of videos and links to pictures and images and fixing and stuff like that. Even one Torah that was eaten by a dog I had to fix. So that's quite an amusing but sad story, but all turned out nice in the end.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. People are leaving. We're trying to get that link right back into the chat one more time. And I'll post it along with the recording in a few days.
Cool.
Marc,
thank you so much, Marc, for your time and your knowledge and for sharing all this. It was fascinating, just fascinating.
Indeed. We almost hit 70 people. That's very good.
Yeah, it was
70,
amazing.
that's very good.
Yeah, very, very good.
Very
And
good.
Chaim and Amalia, you did a great job. Thank
Thank
you for your putting this together. I think this was really an excellent roundtable. I mean, it was just wonderful. So thank you so much for putting this together.
Yeah.
Marc,
Thanks to Chaim. Thanks to Chaim for inviting Marc, actually.
Yes, very nice.
So this is going to be the first of many. So I'd love to be invited to the.
Oh, indeed.
You can always join the Association of Jewish Libraries and get all of our emails.
Can you? I thought you only had to be a library to join the.
Absolutely not.
No. Oh, okay.
Marc, I'm the president of the organization and I am not a librarian. So.
Oh, okay.
So
Fine, yes.
anybody can join.
I will make sure I'm on your mailing list then.
Yes.
I'll send you the link, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I am off to my next meeting. Thank you
Enjoy.
again, everyone. This was great. And I do hope to see you again. And I hope to see another one of these wonderful programs. So thank you.
We have more coming.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.